tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Let's move on to this other issue, which admittedly was one that completely stayed off my radar until I read about it from Janice Fiamengo's great newsletter, the Fiamengo File. And part of the reason it completely escaped me is because it involves someone who used to play for the NHL, which I'm told is a cricket league. Maybe it's football, hockey, NHL, hockey, yeah. I get so many angry emails when I do that gag. I know NHL is hockey. That's about all I know. But it was a rather moving PSA from a former NHL figure. Let's roll this for you now.
Standing by.
I don't remember the hit. I remember everything leading up to it, but nothing after. He came from behind me. I didn't see it coming. I was hit in the side of the head. I remember being confused, my ears were ringing. It's hard to talk about. I still experience pain, mood swings. The headaches are debilitating. But this isn't my story.
It's mine.
That was former Vancouver Canucks captain Trevor Linden in a PSA for the YWCA, talking about the disparity between concussions in hockey and concussions in women who have suffered from domestic violence. Now, I should say, first and foremost, it's a very compelling, powerful ad. It's very well produced. It's a well presented message. It's a shocking message when they say 92% of women, girls, and gender diverse people who experience traumatic brain injury do so as a result of violence by an intimate partner. And they also talk about the staggering statistics of what percentage of women will encounter a brain injury from this. And I'll talk about those numbers in a moment, but I just first want to say it's often very odd when people try to link two disparate issues and two distinct issues together. One kind of random one that just happened to come up yesterday is this tweet from Neurodiversity Ireland. So neurodiversity is typically the world of autism. And they say that there's no neurodiversity without LGBTQ+. And we can't be neuroaffirming without being LGBTQ+ affirming. And we can't respect people with autism unless we respect people with LGBTQ+ identity. And you're looking at this and you're like, I don't know why these two things matter. And this is where you get into territory where you're making comparisons that are leading people to a particular conclusion that might not be the right one. But in this particular case, we have numbers that are contributing to that. Janice Fiamengo is a retired professor from the University of Ottawa and also writes the Fiamengo File on Substack and joins me now. Janice, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your show, Andrew. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about this concussion campaign hoax.
The key paragraph here, just to put into context that staggering number there, is that 4 in 10 women and girls in Canada will face violence from a current or former partner, according to Statistics Canada. And 92% of those will suffer a traumatic brain injury due to blows to their head or strangulation. And you say in your newsletter here, that is effectively saying that more than 30% of Canadian women, and girls, more than 3 in 10, will get a brain injury from battering. So the numbers are pretty clear there. What do they get wrong?
Well, everything is wrong in it. It's also mentioned that for every one professional hockey player who experiences a concussion, 7,000 girls and women in Canada will experience traumatic brain injury or a concussion. So I looked that up. It says that on average, about 80 professional hockey players suffer concussion a year. So 80 times 7,000, that, if my math is correct, would be about 560,000 Canadian girls and women suffering concussion from intimate partner violence every year. That is a staggering number. Now, how is that number arrived at? Well, first of all, there's the reference to the StatsCan survey, which found that more than 4 in 10 Canadian women reported suffering from intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. It also happened to mention that about 1/3 of Canadian boys and men reported suffering from intimate partner violence as well. But of course, that's not mentioned. Then it gets to another study that makes this claim about 92%. However, when you look into both of these studies, you realize that the social science behind the claims is simply not, it doesn't support those particular claims. And I really looked into this very carefully. For one, the claim about 44% of girls and women suffering intimate partner violence, it is a large survey conducted by StatsCan, over 43,000 people, but they measure violence so extremely elastically that it clearly has nothing to do with concussions. They count violence to include psychological violence. That means being called a bad name. They count a wide range of so-called physical violence, including someone punching a wall, having an object thrown at you that may or may not have hit you, that might have caused damage if it had. They count being forced or someone trying to force you to perform a sex act that you didn't want to perform, shoving, all sorts of things. So, and while I would agree that some of these things are certainly abusive and some of them are violence, I don't think the psychological violence is quite at the same level, being called a bad name. But certainly it is hard to see how those types of violence could possibly lead to traumatic brain injury. So there's a big problem with the total number there. When we go to the 92%, it gets even stranger.
But
that takes us,
just to jump in on those figures first, because I want to just preempt the obvious criticism here that you and I are downplaying this, when I certainly am not, and I know you're not. And I believe that abuse is wrong, but abuse and violence have never, in my understanding, been synonyms. I mean, I'll defer to you as the English professor, but those words have very different meanings. So they're including things that are that are abusive and non-physical as violence.
Yes. And that's a huge problem for understanding what it means when people start talking about the numbers of women and girls who suffer from supposed violence.
And violence that's not directed at the woman or girl, but at a wall or throwing a plate or something, which again could be very threatening. It could be very traumatizing, could be a stepping stone to violence, but it is not directed at a person.
Right. And it has absolutely nothing to do with traumatic brain injury, clearly. And, it's impossible to tell from the survey how severe the violence was that was reported. So they lump in everything. If you remember that 20 years ago, you had a jealous partner, that will be counted as your having experienced violence along with everything else. There isn't even a category in the StatsCan survey and the report that was based on it for the types of violence that lead to traumatic brain injury, which are choking until you pass out or violence to your head. They don't even have a category for blows to the head. So they're talking about a whole range of issues. They lump together, for example, being shoved, pushed, or thrown down. Well, even right there, it's impossible to know how severe. To be shoved, yes, that might be quite severe, or it might not be very severe at all. And there is no way of telling from the survey whether that violence led to the person having to go to the hospital, whether it led to an actual injury or not. It is simply a way of measuring self-reports. We don't really know what those numbers mean at all. And the range of types of acts or verbal acts that are measured there is simply far too elastic to draw any clear conclusions about numbers.
So with that, how do they get to that 92%?
Yeah. So 92% is even stranger, and I find more shocking. It refers to a study, which then refers to another study. So it isn't even the study that's referred to. That study is an American study of Black women who experienced severe violence, both in childhood and in their adult life, specifically being choked or being knocked unconscious. Out of those, it was only 95 women. That's a fairly small survey. Out of those women, about 33% experienced assumed, not even clarified, but assumed traumatic brain injury. Now, within that study, it referred in a background section of the report to another study that found up to 92%, listen to this, of women who experienced traumatic brain injury, 92% of those women had received the traumatic brain injury as a result of intimate partner violence. So then they flipped the numbers around and said that of women who experience intimate partner violence, up to 92% will have traumatic brain injury. I think that's called a faulty syllogism.
I think I learned that in my first week of research methods in university, which was like a mandatory course that everyone had to do, of like one of the things that you are never supposed to do when analyzing data.
Yes.
Is reverse your cause and your effect.
Yes, I find that shocking. It either indicates, I mean, I don't know what to conclude about that, except that either the researchers who come up with these claims are not able to read the studies that they're basing their claims on, or it means that they are deliberately misinforming us, misrepresenting the studies that they're relying on. But either way, it is a shocking misrepresentation of the reality of intimate partner violence.
Your point on this is something I'm curious about, because obviously I think facts matter. And I think regardless, this is not, in my view, a moral judgment on the substance of this. It's saying that these are the numbers, and the numbers don't lie unless we interpret them the way they do, and then we can twist them. But ultimately, this is still a real issue, and we know that intimate partner violence exists, and we know that it can have very serious mental and physical consequences. So why is this something that's so important to you?
Well, for one thing, although we know that intimate partner violence exists, I don't think we really have any clear understanding of how prevalent it is and how serious it is. And I don't think we have any understanding from these kinds of studies, which inflame the situation. Notice, of course, again, male victims of violence are never mentioned here. So
no, and there have been some Statistics Canada surveys that have found males are 50% of victims of intimate partner violence.
This particular one found that males report violence at a rate of 36%. In their lifetimes, boys and men will experience some form of intimate partner violence, compared to that 44%. So that is not a massive discrepancy there. And we're talking about mostly boys and men who are victimized by girls and women. So when we're talking about violence, I think it's very important to understand that violence is a human problem. It is not a problem in which males are solely perpetrators and girls and women are solely victims. It tends to be caused, not as the feminists will tell us, because men are exerting their power over women and girls and, through violence, which is what this campaign specifically says. But no, actually, most people who are not feminist ideologues who study this problem will tell us that violence occurs because of a variety of circumstances. They're the same for both males and females, and they have to do with substance abuse, they have to do with mental illness, and they have to do with childhood abuse. People who are abused as children tend to become abusers. So that is a much more human way of understanding the problem. I would say a much more useful way. And what a campaign like this does with these really staggering numbers is it demonizes boys and men, and it terrorizes girls and women, and it misinforms girls and women about the realities of the world that we live in. And I think it makes it seem justified to treat boys and men as a category of human being who are deserving of contempt, disgust, and harsh punishment. And I think it also means that when boys and men are accused of violence or sexual violence, that we tend to think, yeah, they're probably guilty, because I heard that horrific statistic about 560,000 girls and women a year being the victim of intimate partner violence. So this is probably a case where this guy did what he's being accused of doing. And I think that's just terrible. It really miseducates all of us about the realities of men and women's lives.
I mentioned before I brought you in that rather absurd tweet trying to link, autism awareness with pride. And I think that we're seeing, to maybe not as dramatic a way of doing that, but something very similar here, of taking this issue that people know that there's been a lot of advocacy on and research in, which is concussions and brain injuries, traumatic brain injuries, and trying to like push it into this other narrative and in a way that maybe it just doesn't quite fit at all. And it's not to say there can't be traumatic brain injury from this, but it's like, if there is, that's not the core issue. The core issue is the intimate partner violence.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I find that often when you read these studies, there was a study a few years ago that's been, well, some years ago now, but it's been repeatedly cited about the relationship between violence against women and natural disasters. There was a huge kerfuffle years ago about the Australian wildfires and claims made that men who came home from fighting those fires were taking out their stress on the women and girls in their lives. And the study that was cited to prove this was a study about Hurricane Katrina that claimed that violence against women had doubled following Hurricane Katrina. And when I looked into that study, it was unbelievable how weak the research was on which that claim was based. It was a tiny study. It showed that, yes, violence had allegedly doubled, but it had gone from a tiny, tiny number in this small study to double that number, which is essentially meaningless when the numbers are so low. And it found that violence against boys and men, that what they had reported anyway, had been higher both before and after Hurricane Katrina. So boys and men were reporting higher levels of psychological violence and higher levels of physical violence, both before and after. And that was never mentioned in any of the discussions about the meaning of the connection between disaster and violence against women. So often there are attempts to, as they say, raise awareness and call for greater resources to be put into protecting girls and women. And it's based on extremely shaky statistics. And it seems designed really just to support a particular worldview, in this case, in which men are always guilty and women are always innocent victims. And it's a shame.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the percentage issue, because that's always been this point that I've tried to take issue with, because I think it's one of the most insidious ways in which something is overblown in terms of its effect. I know with hate crimes, we see it all the time, where there'll be a report that says, hate crimes against this group have increased by 60%. And you look at the numbers and they've gone up by 14 individual cases. And that's an increase in 60%. And I remember I wrote a column about this years ago when I was with Global News, and the editor actually would not publish large parts of it because they say, well, no, percentages don't lie. And I said, well, actually they do. If they don't lie in the sense that, yes, 60% of 100 is 60, but they do lie when you're trying to make a point that something has had this dramatic increase.
Exactly.
There's a difference between something going up from 1,000 to 1,600, say, and something going up from 10 to 16.
Indeed. Yes. And that is the thing. And, and it's so frustrating when you see that people with an agenda are quite willing to obfuscate by using the percentage rather than giving us the actual numbers. And so many of us don't have time, to look. This took me a couple hours, to read through that huge StatsCan report and to actually figure out what they meant by violence, and then to look through the various studies that were cited to prove this 92% number. Most people don't have time to do that kind of research. So that's why it's so important that the people who are doing the reporting are scrupulous about explaining to us what those numbers actually mean. And when you mix in advocacy, political agendas with reporting, you get this kind of, phantasmatic scaremongering. And it's really concerning.
Janice Fiamengo, you can read her takedown of this PSA and lots of other great work over at the Fiamengo File on Substack. Janice, thank you so much for coming on today. Great to talk to you as always.
Great to talk to you, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.